On August 23, 1972, a 20-year-old woman in Washington borrowed her little sister's waffle stomper boots, climbed onto a white 10-speed bicycle, and started pedaling toward a horse stable 6 miles northeast of her family's home. It was a warm summer afternoon. The sun was still high in the sky, the roads were mostly empty, and for the first time, she decided to ride her bike instead of driving. She never made it there. A tiny stain on the outside of one of those borrowed boots sat unnoticed for 36 years. Investigators from multiple agencies handled the evidence over the decades. Detectives opened and reopened the case. Crime lab technicians examined the clothing again and again. Nobody saw it. When a Washington State crime lab technician finally noticed the stain in 2008, it contained the DNA of the man who murdered her. Her name was Jody Loomis. Jody was 20 years old and living with her parents, her fiancé Jim Roberts, and her 12-year-old sister Jana at their home on Winesap Road in unincorporated Snohomish County, Washington. Today, the area is part of Mill Creek. But back in 1972, it looked very different. The roads were rough and narrow. There were horse properties scattered between dense stretches of forest. Houses sat far apart from one another, separated by fields, dirt driveways, and trees. It was quiet country. The kind of place where someone could disappear without anybody noticing for hours. Jody loved horses. She kept one named Saudi at a stable on Strum Road, roughly 6 miles from home. She made the trip regularly and almost always drove. But on August 23rd, she changed her routine. She borrowed Jana's waffle stomper boots sometime that afternoon, wheeled out her bicycle, and left the house around 5 p.m. Nobody realized they were watching her for the last time. The ride to the stable took her along Penny Creek Road, through long wooded stretches with almost no traffic. At one point, a narrow dirt track branched away from the road and disappeared into the trees. That dirt track became the center of a murder investigation that would remain unsolved for nearly half a century. Around 5:30 p.m., a young couple drove down that same dirt path intending to do some target shooting in the woods. Instead, they found a woman lying on the ground. She was mostly unclothed. She had been sexually assaulted, and she had a gunshot wound above her right ear from a .22 caliber pistol. She was still alive. Barely. The couple rushed toward her and realized she was breathing but completely unresponsive. They picked her up, carried her to their car, and drove straight to Stevens Memorial Hospital in Edmonds, around 15 minutes away. They didn't stop to wait for police. They didn't stop to cover her. They just drove. Doctors pronounced Jody dead shortly after arrival. The names of the couple who found her were never publicly released. Investigators quickly determined that Jody had likely been intercepted somewhere along Penny Creek Road and forced at gunpoint into the woods. Evidence suggested she had been sexually assaulted before being shot while trying to put her clothes back on. Her white 10-speed bicycle was discovered abandoned near the dirt track entrance. Her clothing was collected from the scene, including the waffle stomper boots she had borrowed from Jana only hours earlier. Everything was packaged, logged into evidence, and transferred to storage at the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office. At first, detectives believed the case might move quickly. There was physical evidence, a crime scene, a murder weapon caliber, a clear timeline. But within days, the investigation began slowing down. Deputies canvassed the surrounding area and interviewed anyone who might have seen something unusual. Several local men immediately drew suspicion. One was a ranch owner who had allegedly behaved inappropriately toward Jody before her death. Neighbors later admitted his behavior had made people uncomfortable, though nobody had ever formally reported him. Another was a nearby tenant who had been chopping wood close to the dirt track that same afternoon. His timeline didn't fully make sense, and investigators struggled to account for parts of his day. Detectives questioned both men extensively, along with several others connected to the area. But suspicion is not evidence. No fingerprints tied anyone to the crime scene. No witnesses saw the attack happen. No weapon was recovered. And in 1972, DNA testing did not exist. By the end of the year, the investigation had stalled completely. The murder of 20-year-old Jody Loomis became Snohomish County's most frustrating unsolved homicide. For investigators, the case became another thick file stored in evidence rooms and filing cabinets. For the Loomis family, it became something much worse. Jana Loomis was only 12 years old when her sister borrowed those boots and never returned home. She spent the rest of her childhood watching grief settle permanently over her family. For a long time after the murder, Jody's bedroom remained almost untouched. Jana later remembered that you could still smell Jody's patchouli oil when you walked into the room. Her purse sat where she had left it. Personal belongings remained frozen in place, like the family was afraid moving anything would somehow erase her. Their lives split into two parts, before August 23, 1972, and after it. Years passed. Jana grew older. She graduated, got married, became Jana Loomis Smith, and built a life of her own. But the murder of her sister never stopped following the family. Her parents continued calling investigators for updates year after year. Why? Usually there were none. The case technically remained open, but there were no leads left to pursue. Decades passed without an arrest. Both of Jody's parents eventually died without learning who killed their daughter. They spent the remainder of their lives carrying the same unanswered question they had first asked in 1972. Who did this? After their deaths, Jana became the public voice of the family. She continued contacting detectives and attending press conferences whenever the sheriff's office announced renewed efforts in the case. She refused to let the investigation disappear quietly into storage. By 2008, she had spent 36 years waiting for answers, nearly twice as long as Jody had been alive. During interviews, Jana spoke openly about what the loss had done to their family. She said they missed Jody's love, her presence, her laughter, and the future she never got to live. At one point, Jana put it even more simply. Jody had her whole life ahead of her, she said, and it was just taken away. In 2005, a cold case detective named Jim Scharf reopened the file. At the time, Jody's murder was the oldest unsolved homicide in Snohomish County. Scharf approached the investigation methodically. He reviewed old reports, revisited witness statements, and examined every piece of preserved evidence that might contain biological material suitable for modern DNA testing. Technology had changed dramatically since 1972. Cases once considered impossible to solve were suddenly becoming solvable. Scharf submitted multiple items to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab for analysis. 3 years later, in 2008, one technician made a discovery that changed everything. On the outside of Jody's left waffle stomper boot was a small stain investigators had somehow overlooked for 36 years. The stain contained semen. The boot had spent decades moving through evidence storage, crime labs, and investigative reviews without anyone noticing it. But under improved lighting conditions and modern forensic examination techniques, the stain finally became visible. The crime lab extracted a partial DNA profile and entered it into CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. CODIS compares crime scene DNA against profiles collected from convicted offenders. If the person who left the DNA had previously submitted a qualifying sample, the system could generate a match within minutes. But in Jody's case, nothing came back. No match. That didn't necessarily mean the killer had no criminal history. It only meant his DNA wasn't in the system. Many offenders from earlier decades were never required to submit samples. Others committed crimes that didn't trigger mandatory DNA collection laws. So the profile remained inside CODIS for years, automatically checked against every new offender added to the database. Still nothing. Jim Scharf kept working the case anyway. He maintained contact with Jana, followed emerging forensic technologies, and refused to let the investigation go dormant again. The case had already lost 33 years before he reopened it. He wasn't going to lose more. Then, in July of 2018, Scharf decided to try something entirely different. He submitted the DNA profile to Parabon Nanolabs, a private forensic company specializing in genetic genealogy. Unlike CODIS, genetic genealogy doesn't look for exact matches to convicted offenders. Instead, it compares crime scene DNA against massive public ancestry databases where ordinary people voluntarily upload their DNA to learn about their family history. Even distant relatives can become clues. If investigators find enough shared DNA between the unknown suspect and someone in the database, genealogists can begin building family trees backward through generations until they narrow the search to specific individuals. Harabon assigned the case to genetic genealogist Deb Stone. Stone spent nearly 60 hours constructing family trees using census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries, newspaper archives, and online ancestry records. Slowly, the branches converged on one family living in Snohomish County. But genealogy alone could not prove guilt. Investigators still needed a direct DNA sample from the suspect himself. On August 28, 2018, law enforcement officers followed the suspect to Tulalip Casino north of Everett. They watched him purchase a cup of coffee, sit at a machine for a while, and eventually throw the cup into a trash can. Once he walked away, detectives moved in and collected it. The cup was immediately sent to the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. Weeks later, the results came back. The DNA recovered from the discarded coffee cup matched the DNA recovered from the semen stain on Jody's boot. The probability of the match belonging to anyone else was estimated at 980 million to 1. After 46 years, investigators finally had their killer. His name was Terrence Miller. Most people knew him simply as Terry. And for nearly 5 decades, he had been living only 5 miles from the crime scene. While detectives worked cold case files and the Loomis family buried both parents without answers, Miller had gone on living his life. He married multiple times, raised children, ran a ceramics business out of his garage, and quietly blended into the community. To neighbors, he looked ordinary. But his history told a darker story. Years before Jody's murder, Miller had already attracted police attention. In 1968, he reportedly exposed himself to a teenage girl while driving a company truck through Mountlake Terrace. During questioning, he admitted to the incident and was cited for lewd conduct. Investigators later uncovered multiple allegations of sexual misconduct spanning decades. There were accusations involving minors. Reports from 2 sisters in 1990. A later allegation involving a man with developmental disabilities. But none of the accusations resulted in significant convictions. Detective Jim Scharf later described Miller as a real predator. And yet his name had never surfaced during the original 1972 investigation. Not once. On April 11, 2019, deputies arrested 77-year-old Terrence Miller at his Edmonds home and charged him with first-degree murder in the death of Jody Loomis. The arrest shocked the local community. Many people knew Miller only as a quiet retiree who operated a ceramic shop with his wife. Sheriff Ty Trenery held a press conference praising advances in DNA technology and the persistence of cold case investigators. 47 years had passed between the murder and the arrest. Miller pleaded not guilty. His bail was set at $1 million, and he posted it. While awaiting trial, he returned home under electronic monitoring. The trial itself was delayed for more than a year due to pandemic-related interruptions and defense challenges surrounding the DNA evidence. Defense attorneys argued that decades of evidence handling had contaminated the boot and compromised the reliability of the forensic testing. At one point, testimony revealed that a crime lab analyst's own DNA had accidentally appeared on a reference sample during testing procedures. The defense used that mistake aggressively. They argued the prosecution's entire case depended on evidence collected nearly 50 years earlier under outdated procedures. But prosecutors focused on the broader chain of evidence. They carefully walked jurors through the discovery of the stain, the development of the DNA profile, the genealogy investigation, the surveillance at Tulalip Casino, and finally the laboratory confirmation connecting the coffee cup directly to the crime scene evidence. Jana Loomis Smith also testified. Nearly half a century after her sister's murder, she stood in a courtroom facing the man accused of killing Jody. She described what those decades had looked like for her family. While the accused celebrated birthdays, holidays, marriages, and ordinary moments of life, her family had remained trapped in grief. All they had left, she said, was the hope of justice. Closing arguments ended on Friday, November 6, 2020. The jury began deliberating that afternoon before breaking for the weekend. Then, on Monday morning, November 9th, Terrence Miller was found dead inside his Edmonds home from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was 78 years old. The jury did not know. As they resumed deliberations that morning, they were completely unaware the defendant was already dead. Later that same day, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. 12 jurors reviewed the evidence, listened to the contamination arguments, examined the DNA chain, and concluded the same thing investigators had concluded years earlier. The semen stain on Jana's borrowed boot belonged to Terrence Miller. And it proved he murdered Jody Loomis in the woods off Penny Creek Road in August of 1972. Detective Jim Scharf later said he was grateful the family at least got to hear the verdict, because in the end, that verdict was the only form of justice still possible. There would be no prison sentence, no years behind bars, no opportunity for the Loomis family to truly reclaim what had been stolen from them, that had been taken away decades earlier. Miller's defense team filed a motion to vacate the conviction. Their argument was that because Miller died before the verdict was read, he'd been denied the constitutional right to appeal and the conviction should be thrown out. Judge Kurtz held a hearing in December 2020. He heard from family members on both sides and from the attorneys. Then he ruled against the motion. It was not the right thing to do, Kurtz said, to erase what the jury had found. The conviction stands. The conviction remained in place. Jana Loomis was 12 years old when she lent her sister those waffle stomper boots on a sunny August afternoon. She was 60 years old when a jury finally said the word guilty. And by then, both of her parents were already gone. For 48 years, the answer had been sitting silently on the outside of a boot stored away in evidence. A stain nobody noticed, a killer nobody suspected, and a family that never stopped waiting. If you enjoyed this case, go check out the other solved cases in the playlist. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more updates.